Greetings, everyone. Hope all of you are having an absolutely fantastic day. I have finally finished my playthrough of Baldur's Gate 3. In my impressions video last week, I said after 2 acts, it was the best game I have ever played. Does that hold up? Let's dive into my review, starting with what I like. Allow me to revisit a criticism I conveyed early in the game's development. Baldur's Gate 3 is not Divinity Original Sin 3. I played early access when it first came out, and honestly, it was disappointing for me. The game felt like Divinity with a new coat of paint and a sharp departure from many of the things I loved about the original Baldur's Gate series. It was years before I dived back into Baldur's Gate 3, and that criticism is something I repeated a couple of times on this channel. After doing a complete playthrough of the game, while Larian has clearly taken lessons and ideas from the Divinity series and implemented them here, Baldur's Gate 3 feels like a wholly unique experience, and not a retread of what Larian has done before. It doesn't feel like a direct sequel to the old games either, but honestly, even coming from the perspective of someone who loved those games, I think that's a good thing. Baldur's Gate 3 reflects a game that takes full advantage of all the technological developments that have happened since Baldur's Gate was released 25 years ago. It doesn't take more than 30 minutes of playing to see without question, from a production standpoint, Baldur's Gate 3 is one of the most impressive CRPGs we've ever experienced. Gorgeously detailed environments, incredible character models, fully cinematic cutscenes, dialogue that is showcased via a multitude of camera angles. There is just clearly a ton of money and effort that has been poured into this game. All of the characters are fully voice acted, and just about every single person you come across has at least 1 or 2 sentences of dialogue to share. Even more impressively, despite this being a 100-hour adventure jam-packed with people for you to speak with, I didn't once have a situation where it seemed like 2 characters looked exactly the same. Part of the reason for this is that BG3 boasts a very robust character creation system. When you start a new game, an intro cutscene plays, and then you are able to select your character. There are 8 different options here. Astarion, Lae'zel, Gale, Shadowheart, Will, and Karlach are all fully developed origin characters. That means they all have their own past, motivations, and reactivity within the world that you wouldn't get if playing as a custom character. For example, Will comes from a famous family in Baldur's Gate, so when you reach that city, you'll have unique dialogue options that reflect someone who was born there. Shadowheart is a worshiper of Shar, so you'll have unique dialogue when coming across Shar's shrines or speaking with other people who worship her. They also each have a personal quest that runs through the entire game. If you don't select one of these origin characters, they will be available as party members depending on the choices you make in your playthrough. If you do select one of them, keep in mind that this person will almost never speak, so you lose the voice acting aspect of having them in your party, and you also essentially lose their personality because of course you are choosing all the dialogue options for them. The advantage is you can ensure they make the decisions you want them to during their storyline. Otherwise, your ability to persuade them is based on how much they approve of your previous words and actions. I played through the game as Will, and while his story is probably still compelling from an outside perspective, walking directly in his shoes was a real joy. In the case of Gale, Shadowheart, and Will, their class is deeply tied into their story. You can still change it, but the game treats them as if they have the same class, so it can make things a little weird. You will not be able to change the character's race or their background option, which we'll talk about later. Due to the drawbacks that I mentioned, some people prefer to play as a custom character. This is someone who has no history, and you have complete control over how to build them. Your first option is to choose your race, and what you select here matters, but not from a mechanical standpoint. Unlike tabletop D&D, race is not paired with ability point increases. So for example, Dragonborn doesn't get a +2 in strength and a +1 in charisma. Instead, regardless of what race you choose, you can get +2 in one ability and +1 in a different option. From a min-maxing perspective, this obviously means that some races have become stronger while other races have become weaker, but honestly, in practice, this doesn't matter because the game isn't super difficult. So what's more important is the consideration of how you want to look and what type of reactivity you want. Different races will provide you with different unique dialogue options, and they will be treated differently. This is most especially true for Dragonborn and Githyanki, because they are very rare sightings in the Sword Coast, so people will be surprised to see you. Humans, the most plentiful race, are oftentimes racist towards tieflings. Drow are despised but also greatly feared. Many of these races have sub-races that help you further hone in on the type of experience you want. Once your race has been chosen, you can move into selecting your class, and this is another area where the game really shines. I think Ranger is pretty crappy, and I am not a fan of Druid, but in fairness, I am rarely a fan of Druid in these types of games. The other 10 classes are all phenomenal. Wizards get a ton of spells, and not only do spells look fantastic, but it's also devastating to see what they do to a battlefield. Fighters truly feel like walking tanks that cleave enemies in two while shrugging off most attacks. Paladins are the most selected class thus far, and I couldn't agree more. Smiting enemies is a ton of fun in this game. Many of the mechanics are ripped straight out of the 5th edition player's handbook, but Larian hasn't been afraid to make changes when they deem it necessary. I played through as a warlock, which doesn't have a hexblade subclass, but to help make up for this, Larian added a pact, which lets you use a melee weapon with charisma as your primary ability as opposed to strength or dexterity. Multi-classing is available in the game, and unlike the tabletop, there are no attribute requirements for you to add another class. At any time, you could just click a button and tack on whatever class you like. There are a ton of accessories, weapons, and armor in the game that will assist a wide swath of different builds. Respecking is available in the game, and it is very cheap to do. So clearly Larian has set up the entire system to reward experimentation and creativity. You are welcome to try just about anything, and if you completely screw up, your build is very easy to start over. Next, you choose your background, and this doesn't give you a history in the same sense as what an origin character has. Instead, it provides a guideline of what your character likes to do, while also providing a couple of skills. Skills are important, but we'll talk about that more in a bit. Let's instead focus on how this choice is important because it determines how your character gains insight. Baldur's Gate 3 is a game that heavily emphasizes rolling dice to get what you want. Whether picking a lock, persuading a character, or trying to move a heavy object, oftentimes you are confronted with a dice rolling interface. For someone like me who was an avid tabletop player, this is absolutely fantastic. I honestly never thought a developer would be able to make the dice front and center while still allowing the game to be fun. Part of the reason I felt this way is because the player cannot control the dice, which means you fail dice rolls all the time. For completionists who want to always win, that could result in a bunch of save scumming to always get the best result possible. Larian has done two things to mitigate this. First, there's actually a lot of content in the game that occurs when you fail dice rolls, so sometimes missing a charisma check is more entertaining than what you would get if you succeeded. In addition, they have implemented an insight system which allows you to re-roll a failed check up to 4 times. You gain insight by doing things that are in line with your background. So for example, if you have a criminal background and steal something of high value, you might gain a point of insight along with some XP. Same thing if you have the folk hero background and do something heroic. Again, this is capped at 4, so if you already have 4 insight points and you accomplish one of these tasks, then you'll only get the extra XP. All of your party members have their own backgrounds as well, so you should be constantly using these points and gaining them. Before we get back to character creation, it's worth noting that the dice Larian has implemented feel extremely fair. I failed a ton of checks, but I also passed a ton as well and rolled a natural 20 many times. There was never a point in the game where I felt like the dice were actively working against me, at least no more than I would when sitting at a tabletop session. Next up, you can customize your ability points. If you've played any D&D based games, there's nothing new here. Each class has a primary ability that determines how good they are at attacking, damaging enemies, and boosting their skills. Unlike the tabletop, you cannot completely dump a stat. The lowest they can be reduced to is 8. Personally, I don't like this, but I understand it's to protect players from crafting an especially terrible build without realizing why it is so terrible. At the top of your screen, you'll see a proficiency bonus that is added to a roll when you are proficient with a particular weapon or skill. This bonus will increase over time. You can also change your skill proficiency, and honestly, the majority of this list pops up pretty consistently, so just pick whatever you are good at. There are a ton of dialogues in this game, so it's nice having someone on the team who's proficient with charisma checks, but again, there's also content that is geared around failing those checks, so ignoring them is a perfectly legitimate way to play. You absolutely want somebody on your team with high ranks in perception so you can see the devastating traps that are littered throughout the game, and someone with high ranks in sleight of hand so you can disable those traps and pick locks. Putting all of this together, you can see how there are hundreds of different ways to construct your character. I mentioned before that BG3 makes experimentation very easy, so you'll get to explore a lot of these different options. The flip side of this is that there are so many dice rolls and so many times that your build's capabilities are put to the test that this game also truly rewards well-crafted characters. It was deeply satisfying playing as Will and never worrying when a dialogue check came up because I knew I was built to handle anything. And anytime when you are going through these options for a custom character, you can click the Edit Appearance button at the bottom, and this opens up a completely different world. Larian has gone through a ton of work to ensure you can craft exactly the type of character you want to see. You can be male, female, or non-binary, along with any shade of color you choose. I have to take a second to point out that regardless of what kind of lighting your character is in, black skin looks amazing in Baldur's Gate 3. That's very rare for games in general, but it's especially rare for CRPGs. Most of the time, dark-skinned characters look like the bad guys, and honestly, are also presented as the bad guys. That's not the case here at all, and it's something I really appreciate. Beyond skin color, there's just a wealth of faces, jewelry, makeup, and scars to choose from. You can give yourself different color eyes or a hint of vitiligo pigmentation. It's really robust and impressive, regardless of your race, but I think Dragonborn are the ones who really shine here. It would have been enough just to provide a game where you can play as this race, but they look absolutely incredible pretty much regardless of what you do. It becomes even more impressive if you select the Draconic Bloodline Sorcerer subclass, which interacts directly with Dragonborn and provides them another layer of visual customization. Bottom line, it's an amazing system and people will spend hours on this screen for years to come. I have one major issue with the process, but we'll talk about that in the dislike section. There is one more character we didn't cover, and that is the Dark Urge, which is basically a middle ground option between the origin characters such as Will that I spoke of earlier and creating your own custom character. The Dark Urge has a questline that centers around a constant urge for you to do violent, terrible things. I haven't played through it yet, but based on the trailers, it definitely seems like this quest will have strong callbacks to the original Baldur's Gate series. The Dark Urge has no restrictions on what type of character you play as, so you can freely choose your own race and class. It's also your decision whether or not to play as a good or evil aligned person. Selecting this gives you access to all the amazing character customization options while at the same time giving you an origin story. Unlike the other origin characters, the Dark Urge is not available as a party member if you don't select it. So if you want to see this storyline, you have to play it for yourself. Larian recommends that you do not use the Dark Urge as your first playthrough because it provides a much different perspective on the story compared to all the other characters, and you won't realize how unique it is unless you have played the game at least once. When all these options are finalized, it's time to actually jump into the game. In the beginning, you are stranded aboard a Mind Flayer ship. You quickly find out that there's a tadpole in your head that will slowly transform you into a Mind Flayer if you don't get rid of it. Mind Flayers are evil, sadistic creatures that dominate other beings, turning them into slaves and eating on their brains. It's not long before you escape from the ship, but the tadpole still remains, along with the danger of being transformed and having your personality wiped. This core issue is what binds together all the different party members. Baldur's Gate 3 does a fantastic job of providing a good reason why all these people from diverse backgrounds would choose to stick together. The situation is so desperate that it makes sense to lean on strength in numbers until the problem is resolved. Until characters warm up to you, some of them make it very clear that as soon as the tadpoles are removed, they will be leaving your party. Speaking of your party members, they are all fantastic in their own way. Will's journey of becoming a true hero and fighting against his Cambion patron is deeply enthralling. Karlach has one of the most endearing personalities I've ever experienced in a party member. Lae'zel's passion and determination to make her queen proud reveals more and more layers as the game goes on. There are some standout party members who are not origin characters, such as the druid Halsin. I didn't use them as much, but what content I did see was great, and I look forward to traveling with them in a new playthrough. It's just really an amazing cast, and deciding who to bring with you at any given time can be quite difficult. The amazing experience each party member provides made me much more comfortable with the party size being limited to 4 characters and having a smaller roster of overall party members to choose from. Having 5 to 6 party members on my team is a major reason I love CRPGs so much, and I consider it to be one of the defining features of the Baldur's Gate series. When Larian confirmed BG3 would only have 4 party members, my interest in the game immediately plummeted. Completing a playthrough changed my perspective because I could see how much depth each party member has. While I love the huge roster of characters from previous Baldur's Gate games, they were not all treated equally. Some of them had one quick quest or even just a short dialogue to recruit them, along with a handful of banter lines. Most of the party members in the game are not like that, and creating 17 different options who are all as deep and detailed as Will would be a monumental task. It would also be more difficult to balance this game and present challenging encounters if you were able to bring 6 party members with all the fantastic mechanics the classes provide. I still love my large parties, but I am comfortable with Larian making this change. I do have one major issue with the party members you get, but we'll talk about that in the dislike section. Usually RPGs that have a huge focus on party members and their quest lines suffer from a mediocre main quest. That is definitely not the case here, as your main storyline is a huge draw that constantly pulls you along to see what will happen next. What I love most about the journey is that it actually makes sense. That may sound odd if you are new to gaming, but those of us who have played quite a few RPGs know that devs love presenting you with grand mysteries or promises of an epic tale that completely falls apart in the end. I remember the first trailer for Baldur's Gate 3 where a devil proclaims that he has the only solution to your tadpole problem. He said he would let you travel around and talk to all kinds of different people, beg, borrow, and steal, but in the end, you'll have to come back to him, was how we closed the conversation. I remember 3 years ago being very intrigued by the trailer, but also feeling like Larian was probably going to let me down, and it would be an easy decision not to take the devil's deal. When I finally got to Act 3 and heard him lay out the entire situation, along with why he felt like working with him was the only way out, there were multiple times I had to just pause in amazement at how everything was clicking into place. Lesser games give you a ton of loose threads, plot holes, or things that don't really add up. I didn't feel any of that by the time the game had revealed most of its mysteries. I've only done a good guy run, so not sure how the game holds up as an evil character, but for me it felt like a complete and tight story had been told. The last thing I'll mention is that BG3 is a hub game done properly. It's not open world, as each act has its own maps, and to some degree, the acts are closed off from each other. This is a strange comparison, but exploring the world made me think a lot about Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. I mentioned in my review of the game that one of the things I really appreciated about it is the hub layout, where everything you see serves a purpose. Nearly all the buildings are used for a quest, and there's never a time where you walk for long stretches desperately trying to find something to do. Baldur's Gate 3 feels the same way, cranked to 100. The maps are incredibly dense with people and places. The city of Baldur's Gate is a triumph, where just about every few steps there's an interesting conversation to listen to or a quest that you can get involved in. What's really amazing about this is that the vast majority of my 100-hour adventure felt like I was working towards completing the main story. Party member quests, side quests, and even small interactions you have oftentimes reveal details about the overarching story, so everything feels very purposeful. While your situation is treated as serious, it's not communicated as if the world is going to end tomorrow. So when you do have brief diversions, it's not immersion breaking. Just all the way around, Baldur's Gate 3 is an incredible experience, and I had a great time playing through the game. There are some aspects of the game that I am neutral on. Act 1 is for the most part bug-free and feels pretty flawless. In Act 2, there are more bugs, but nothing that really hampers the experience, so it's not a noteworthy issue. Act 3 is a completely different story. My game crashed 2 to 3 dozen times while making my way through Baldur's Gate. Graphical errors, strange camera angles, and noticeable audio issues marred many of the significant cutscenes ending major quests. There are significant in-game sequences where you pretty much have to summon allies, and sometimes those allies were automatically hostile against me when that was clearly not intended. All in all, it was definitely messy, but I put this in the neutral section because if you ask me, do I feel like it was so bad that Larian should have stuck with BG3's original release date? My answer is no. 60 to 70 hours of my adventure was near flawless, and the final 30 hours feels like it just needs a couple of large patches to clear everything up. Circling back to Divinity Original Sin 2, when that game first released, Act 3 was in a terrible state that was borderline unplayable, and there's a strong case to be made the game should have been pushed back. BG3 isn't nearly that bad. Another issue I am neutral on is how the game handles romance. If you've been following my coverage, you know I love romances in games and that I believe they make an RPG experience significantly better. On the one hand, there are some really strong aspects to how romance is handled in BG3. Some of the party members are cold to you at first, so trust has to be built up. The game handles flirtation very well, and Karlach especially has great dialogue if you are trying to romance her. Unfortunately, it's way too easy for party members to get the impression you are trying to romance them, which can cause uncomfortable scenes. In other RPGs, it's not a big deal, because you shut somebody down one time and then it's not a problem anymore. In BG3, romances can start up at multiple points in a playthrough. So for example, in my run, I had to hurt Gale's feelings no less than 3 times. Even despite this, there was a weird scene where we were sitting together in the grass, way closer than any guys in a platonic relationship position themselves. An even bigger issue for me is that while the game is fantastic at flirtation, I am not impressed with how it handles love. I spent 50 hours flirting with Karlach and looking forward to actually being in a full relationship with her. I finally got that relationship and we sealed the deal. There are a couple of dialogues about how happy we are together, and in Act 3 you can do an activity with her that you've already seen if you watch the panels from hell. That's pretty much it. It felt to me like a game that's deeply concerned with everything that happens before you are in a committed relationship, but there's not nearly enough thought about how to make things equally engrossing once the two of you are a pair. I found that to be disappointing. The game handles intimacy in a very adult way, with fully nude character models and scenes of intercourse that reflect the personality of who you are with. Larian spoke about this publicly, saying that they are the first studio to use intimacy coordinators for motion captured intercourse scenes. By no means have I seen all of the intimacy scenes in the game, so the others might absolutely be fantastic, but Karlach's second scene is deeply problematic. She picks Will up and lays him on the bed. Then she pushes his legs up, reaches down to her pelvic area, and thrusts forward as he moans in pleasure. It pretty clearly depicts her sticking a big old red dick into my boy. This is problematic because A, Karlach doesn't have a dick, and B, the game never asks Will if he's comfortable being penetrated in these types of situations. The scene is just super weird and goofy in a bad way. Again, I only dealt with Karlach, so the other scenes might be significantly better, and I had no issues with her first scene. But at the time of this review, as far as the intimacy coordinators, I think Larian could have saved some money. Prior to the game's release, many of you conveyed that you wouldn't be buying it because combat was strictly turn-based. I am neutral on combat in this game, but that's not a reflection on its quality because what Larian has provided is fantastic. Instead, I think I've just been spoiled by Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. So let's break this down. On the one hand, as I have already mentioned, the class mechanics are incredible, and seeing them play out during a fight is a real joy. Whether you are ranged, melee, or focused on spellcasting, there's a lot to love here. There's a ton of different enemies who employ a variety of different tactics, so it doesn't feel like you are facing the same foe over and over. There are no random encounters, so every battle you engage in is a set piece meant to challenge you. Larian has also implemented features to help make turn-based combat faster and more interesting than similar types of games. If 2 or more enemies have turns back to back and they all need to move, they will move at the same time, as opposed to you waiting for each one to take their turn. Similarly, if you have party members who are taking turns right after each other, then you can mix and match their actions however you see fit. So you could move one of them, then cast a spell with the other, then perform an action with the other, or whatever combination works for you. All of this serves to keep the player more engaged, and it helps the battles go faster than they do in similar turn-based only experiences. Unfortunately, this also results in combat being too easy. The game doesn't feel like it's properly balanced for a team that has all the incredible equipment and ability abilities at your disposal. I played on balanced and never encountered a fight that I was really worried about losing. There's a wealth of feedback online from people who play the entire game on Tactician and feel the same way. It's not just the balancing that makes combat too easy, it's also the fact you can rest just about whenever you like. There are some specific areas that are considered combat zones where you cannot rest, but those are very rare in the game, and I cannot remember one where you can just walk outside, rest, and then walk back inside to finish the zone. Resting requires camping supplies or food, but both of them are plentiful enough in the game that you are guaranteed never to run out. In this type of game, what usually makes it difficult is that you have to rest sparingly, and consequently must carefully choose when to use your very best powers. In Baldur's Gate 3, you can literally go out with your most powerful spells and abilities every single fight, and there's nothing holding you back. Personally, I love this because I play games for story, dialogue, and fun factor. Challenge is really secondary for me, but I do think it's a knock against the game that large swaths of people who are looking for a challenge cannot find it here. Also, while Larian has implemented features to make turn-based combat faster, at the end of the day, it's still slow compared to the original Baldur's Gate games. This, in combination with the difficulty issues, is why I brought up Wrath of the Righteous, a game that lets you switch between turn-based and real-time with pulse combat on the fly. Frankly, it's a feature that I wish every game would emulate. In BG3, there will be many times when only a couple of trash goblins remain, but you will still need 2 rounds of combat to take them out, just because the game is turn-based. In Wrath of the Righteous, when the end is clear, you turn on real time and quickly bring combat to a close. Also, that game has 7 difficulty settings to ensure you get the exact type of combat experience you want. BG3 only has 3 options: Explorer, which is basically story mode, Balance, which is normal, and Tactician, which is their version of hard. Take this next point with a grain of salt, because my playthrough was as a good aligned character, but from what I have seen, playing as evil aligned forces you to pretend that you are dumb. I love games that allow you to be an evil character who is highly intelligent, independent, and focused on expanding their own power. If they play as someone's patsy, they do it knowingly, with the intent of turning on that character as soon as it suits their purpose. From what I have seen, BG3 presents evil in an unintelligent way, where you have to go along with things that are clearly not to your benefit, just so you can take the evil option. I put this in the neutral section for now because, again, I haven't actually played an evil character, but from what I saw in the game and comments from other people doing an evil playthrough, it seems like there's a lot left to be desired. The last aspect of this game I am neutral on is the ending. I mentioned in my impressions video that endings can make or break a game, and previously I have been unimpressed with the endings Larian has provided. On the one hand, this ending is definitely better than what we got from Divinity Original Sin 2. Larian said there are over 17,000 different possible endings, and while I feel that is a stretch, there is an impressive amount of variety in regards to how your playthrough wraps up. Unfortunately, the ending still doesn't feel worthy of the epic 100-hour adventure you have just finished. There is not nearly enough information provided about what happens after you have finally won. I know all games are different, but seriously, I don't understand why every large-scale RPG doesn't end the same way as Dragon Age Origins. That game gives you a full epilogue, walking through all the areas you've touched and providing some details about how your actions impacted them. BG3 doesn't provide anything close to this, and it's a real shame because questions are left unanswered about how your stories truly end. Considering how vastly different your endings can be, it's doubtful we'll be getting post-game DLC to help wrap up some of these stories. Larian has said they'll listen to community feedback for ways to improve upon the game, and I really hope players push for more information to be added into the game's endings. Alright, finally, let's get into what I don't like about this game. I mentioned earlier there's one major issue with the party members. Minx is poorly implemented, and I am strongly against the decision to include Jaheira. Jaheira's romance in Baldur's Gate 2 is fantastic, and one of my favorites in all of gaming. I understand that there's a canon BG2 ending, and it may very well not include romancing her. Despite this, having a playthrough where she makes little mention of the ball spawn while speaking fondly of her dead husband was more than a little jarring. It felt like my storyline had basically been retconned, which is probably true, but I don't have to like it. Even more importantly, it takes way too long to get Jaheira in your party. It is almost always a bad idea to make players wait a long time before recruiting a party member, because it's very unlikely they'll actually use them. Jaheira isn't available until the end of Act 2, which was 58 hours into my adventure, and it was 77 hours before I finally recruited Minx. It would be very difficult to fast track Jaheira's recruitment, and in the case of Minx, it's impossible unless you are just going to skip over large swaths of the game. Despite getting both characters very late, they come with terrible equipment, so if you didn't plan accordingly, you'll have to wait until they can be outfitted in a way that benefits the party. But at least once you get Jaheira, she has a couple of quests, an approval rating you can increase, and in general, there's enough content for her to seem on the same level as the rest of your party. While Minx definitely has some funny lines, as far as I can tell, he has no personal quest, no romance, and no content outside of banter and a couple of conversations. He also has no approval rating, so it doesn't feel like your relationship changes over time. I would have strongly preferred that Jaheira was removed entirely and they made Minx the party member you get at the end of Act 2 with a similar amount of content as the rest of your party members. Larian made a huge deal of his inclusion in BG3, showing off Minx in a trailer during the Game Awards and making sure everyone knew that Matt Mercer would be voicing him. On some level, I respect the fact that Larian forces you to spend the bulk of your time with new party members, so I won't go so far as to say the marketing campaign was disingenuous, but I will definitely say the way Minx's inclusion was presented prior to release is problematic, considering what we actually got. Even more disturbing, neither Minx nor Jaheira hold the title for the original Baldur's Gate character with the worst implementation in BG3. I won't say more to avoid spoilers, but yeah, it's pretty bad. I mentioned before that there is one aspect of character creation I don't like, and that issue is the interface doesn't tell you what each class provides as you level up. You basically have to look at what the class gives you at level 1 and then make a guess about whether or not it interests you. There's no way to know that at level 2, Fighter will give you a feature that provides one extra ability, or that Paladins receive smites at the same level. This can make creating builds very irritating if you are not already familiar with the tabletop mechanics of each class. Even if you are, Larian has changed some things for the game. So while overall I would say this game probably has the best character creator I've ever played with, from a strictly mechanic standpoint, I still prefer Solasta Crown of the Magister, because that game lets you see everything your class and subclass will provide at each level. Another weak point of this game is the inventory system. I think it's official that this is an area where Larian struggles, as inventory management was a huge pain in the Divinity series as well. You pick up a ton of loot over the course of this adventure, and the interface to manage it is very clunky until you familiarize yourself with all the ins and outs. Larian provides virtually no information to help you navigate this menu, so it's basically trial and error to come up with a system that feels manageable. In a baffling design choice, you cannot access the inventory of party members who are not directly in your party when you are camping. So if Lizelle is not in your party and you want to give her some new heavy armor, you need to camp, kick out a party member, which requires talking to them, recruit Lizelle, which again requires talking to her, switch the gear out, kick Lizelle back out, which requires talking to her, and then get the party member you want again, which of course requires talking to them. Yikes! That is a big time waste. Worsening this situation is that, in my opinion, the crafting system is subpar. Divinity Original Sin 2 had similar inventory management issues, but it was worth dealing with to enjoy a superb crafting system that you could legitimately build a powerful party member around. I loved making Ifan my elemental archer, who crafted arrows and grenades to completely control the battlefield. BG3's crafting system lets you make health potions and speed potions that give you haste. Most of the rest of it is mediocre, especially by the time you get to Act 3. I find myself selling the vast majority of scrolls, potions, and grenades I came across. The last issue I want to note is that its strange companion skills don't matter during cutscenes and conversations. If, for example, you pick up an object and need to pass an investigate check, everything is based upon the character who actually started the scene. The game won't allow you to just use the party member with the highest investigate score. This is completely contrary to a tabletop environment where everybody works together to achieve a good result. Shadowheart should be able to look over my shoulder, notice a unique detail about the object, and then share that information with the group. It isn't clear to me why Larian chose not to allow for this. That completes my review of Baldur's Gate 3. Unquestionably, it's one of the best games I have ever played. Is it the very best game I've ever played? It's certainly in the running, but I think that question will be answered by its replayability. I am going to dive into our Dark Urge Let's Play ASAP to see if an Evil playthrough will be just as enjoyable as my first one. Hope all of you enjoyed this video. Take care.